On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ashu Agte. He is the SVP of Engineering at Artera. We're going to be talking about dealing with an exit and the impacts on organizational transformation and design. Ashu's gone through a couple of them. He's got a great background and a wealth of experience to draw on. We're going to try to fit in as much as we can on this episode. Ashu, I'm super excited to have you on.
Thanks, Amir. Super excited to talk about all the topics you mentioned.
Absolutely. I know we got a lot to get through. But before we start, let's have you tell us what the company does. And also, as the SVP of Engineering, what are some of the responsibilities you have?
So Artera, we are serving the health tech vertical. Artera is the messaging platform for health systems. So hospitals want to communicate to the patients. They use our platform to communicate, whether it might be SMS, text message, email, phone call, any type of communication. They use our platform. And our focus is to improve patient experience. If you look at the customer satisfaction surveys and the companies that have really good score, if you actually create the priority, health systems rank third lowest in customer satisfaction. Lowest is federal government, second lowest is telecommunication, third lowest is health system. So our mission is to improve patient communication and in turn patient satisfaction from the health systems that they are part of.
Absolutely. And then as the SVP of Engineering, I know you're the head of engineering. What are some of the things that fall at your plate?
So I have three organizational responsibilities. First one is, of course, the software engineering, which is our SaaS product, which is the messaging platform. The second part is, of course, DevOps and the cloud aspects of our platform. And then the third one is data. Data has two aspects, reporting and analytics, as well as machine learning, data science, and AI. So if you aggregate them, there are three sort of major functions within the organization: software, DevOps, and data.
Awesome. So the episode's going to be mainly around dealing with an exit, different components of it. You've gone through a number of them. Just to set the stage, and we'll catch up hopefully to Artera and what's happening in real time. But tell us a little bit about exits you've gone through before we dive in and talk about how you actually deal with them.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting topic. And I have not seen a lot of article or a lot of stories being talked about these situations, right? There's usually three outcomes of a startup: getting acquired, going IPO or fully private, or not succeeding at all. So one of the outcome is always some type of exit. So I'm going to share three stories. I think that would be the best way to have this conversation, Amir, that going through those stories, you can ask me more questions. I'm an open book. I'll answer pretty much everything under the sky. And then we'll try to figure out some takeaways and themes that have learned, and then we'll navigate that conversation. So I have had three startups that I've joined and then three exits, and Artera is the fourth startup. So we'll figure out the future of Artera.
You're lucky charm. I think if it's 4 for 4, I mean, that could be a magic trick on its own.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. So the first startup I was part of was called QPass in Seattle. I joined that company in 2003. And when we got acquired, this was pre-smartphones. We were trying to do mobile payments and were in financial services when we all had flip phones back then. I don't know how many people remember that, how many listeners will remember that. So I joined as a senior software engineer, 2 years out of school. And at the startup, I started moving in the path of leadership. So I was a senior manager when we got acquired a long time ago, 2006. And we got acquired by a public company. Amdocs is a huge, globally successful company. Their vertical is telecommunications, and which was why they acquired us. And post-acquisition, it was a very successful exit. Post-acquisition, I had three choices. So many internal startup leaders were either founding or joining other startups so I could go along with them and see if there are positions for me. Second option in Seattle back then was always Microsoft's and Amazon's of the world. And then the third option was to stay on. And all the options were on the table. I was doing a startup and I wanted an experience of navigating a global, extremely successful, big public company. So I decided, instead of going to Microsoft's and Amazon's, let me just stay on and fill in the void that the leaders who went on to do these startups left at Amdocs. So it was a conscious decision back then, and it turned out to be an amazingly rewarding experience, becoming from senior manager to a director to a senior director, running a whole department of globally distributed organizations. I learned what to do, what not to do, kind of boot camp in a way of how to operate. So that was a really, really good experience. I stayed post-acquisition for 8 years. So that was a very, very interesting pattern that emerged out of it, that if things work out, you can easily stay for a very, very long time post-acquisition. And that is definitely a unique pattern that emerged out of that acquisition. So moving on from that one, so what happened after a while is I started getting the itch again to go back to do another startup. So the next startup that I did was Simply Measured, which was in a marketing technology. So I moved from financial technology to marketing technology, and I was an executive for the first time, and again, head of engineering and running the engineering organization. Now that exit, after 3 years there, that exit had a completely different pattern. We got acquired by a bigger startup, not a big, massive public company, just a bigger startup. And in that pattern, what happened was there are duplicate leaders on both sides, right? Granted, the other startup that acquired us was bigger, but you have head of sales, there's a head of sales. You have head of engineering, there is a head of engineering. And there isn't a lot of need for these kind of duplicate leaders in a startup, even though it's a bigger startup environment. So in that situation, what happened was I was in a transitionary role where I was asked to stay for 3 months to help transition the engineering organization to the new leader. So there's definitely an interesting pattern emerging out of it. And I'm not sure that is something I should have done, or my advice to the companies would be to not put incoming leaders from an acquisition in that spot. The main reason for that is the roles and responsibilities are ambiguous. And the second thing that happens is that everybody in the company knows it's a transitional role. So because of that, it is a lame duck situation, right? So everybody knows I'm going to move on. So ability to navigate and ability to help facilitate is super complicated and ambiguous. Even though it was a great experience to help out the team and the organization move on, I don't necessarily think that was one of the greatest things I should have either said, all right, it's a 1-year goal and we just don't communicate to the organization. And when that 1-year milestone shows up, I move on, or I move on day one as part of the acquisition, right? So that was the thing. And again, this has no poor reflection on Simply Measured or Sprout Social, the companies that acquired us. This happens all the time, right? There have been times when a leader decides to resign and the leadership asks them, can you give us 2 months? Same thing happens. Like that whole thing, I've rarely seen when somebody's on the way out and everybody knows that really works. So that was one of the anti-patterns that I would be recommending to people to not get into the situation. Again, I'm generalizing it. There might be stories that completely go in the opposite direction and say this was the perfect thing to do. But I would advise leaders as well as acquiring companies to not do that, if there is one advice I can provide as part of this. The third acquisition was So after 3 months of transitionary period, I decided to join another startup. And at that point, I moved to the Bay Area. This is 2018. And I joined a startup in a construction technology vertical called Building Connected. And it had a similar flavor as Amdocs, where we got acquired by an amazing and an extremely successful public company called Autodesk. And the interesting nuance there was I was part of that acquisition as an executive as compared to Amdocs, where I was just a senior manager. So I had more agency, I had financial handcuffs. The interesting nuance that was going on at Autodesk back then is they had acquired 3 companies almost back to back, and they were merging them into its own sort of department or a division within the company. So there were 3 startups, 3 executive and the leaderships and heads of department of 3 startups merging into one. And that was a little bit of a tricky challenge to navigate as 3 companies figuring out what their future is in this massively, amazingly successful company. So what I did was I let things unfold for a while. And then I realized that the role post-acquisition that I have, because I had to stay post-acquisition due to financial handcuffs, is not something that is super exciting for me. But the advantages of a big public company is you have internal mobility. So what I decided at that time was to figure out another role internally. And coincidentally, I was lucky to find an amazing role within the organization to lead AutoCAD, which is the flagship product of Autodesk. So I became head of engineering for AutoCAD, an amazingly talented engineering organization across 5 countries. And it was an amazingly rewarding experience. So if you look at these 3 stories, one was stay in the current role, current organization. Second one was should have left sooner. Third was stay, let things unfold and move. So I would say, I'm pretty sure you have lots of questions, Amir, as you hear these stories, but sort of my takeaway or advice to anybody who's getting acquired, especially in a leadership role, is to just have grit and resilience. And most importantly, be patient. Just give it time for things to really unfold around you to get you clarity, not just about the situation, but emotions are always high post-acquisition, especially in the company that is getting acquired. There is anxiety. Are there going to be layoffs? Is there going to be cultural clash? Which tools are going to switch? Which leaders are staying? Is there going to be reorg? It is tons of emotions and anxiety. So also that patient gives time for emotions to settle down. And then once that has happened, things have unfolded, there is new normal set in and emotions have settled down, then make a call. Don't make a call when things are in flux or there is an emotional storm going on within the organization or within your head. So just be patient and then stay, leave, move internally. All these things will become clear. So that's sort of the advice.
No, it's fantastic advice. And I mean, great stories. I mean, I'm listening and the first question that comes to my mind is, joining 3 startups and 3 successful exits. I mean, we could say you're lucky, but obviously you saw something in each of the startups that attracted you. I guess, looking back on, and they're 3 different industries as well. So it's not like you were like, hey, I now know the industry, I know what to look for. But I guess just looking back and looking across the 3 different startups, are there any commonalities of what attracted you to them?
So I do have sort of a criteria for what I look for when I'm looking for a new job or I'm thinking about where my next move is. The first and the foremost is what is the mission of the company? And that matters to me a lot. And is that something I can resonate with? The second thing that matters is the leadership team, because what happens is most of the waking hour is spent with the leadership team. And I want to make sure that there are people I can work with, I can relate with, Do they have that grit? Do they have that resilience? Do they have that fire to go and solve the problem that needs to be solved to fulfill the mission? And then the third thing for me, which is most important, is the culture. I mean, there is a saying, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that is so true. If the culture is not healthy, amazing missions, amazing opportunities can just dissolve into nothing. Like they don't mean anything at all. So for me, those three are the critical ingredients that I've always figured out. That what is the mission and the problem? How is the executive team trying to solve it, and how they come together and show up as one, and the culture of the company. And that has been a constant for me. Then rest of the things are just, right, like revenues or situations and all that stuff. Of course, that due diligence is necessary, but those are not sort of hard and fast. I have joined startups with 20 engineers, and I have joined startups where there were 70 engineers already. So those things, of course, are contextual, but these are the things I rarely negotiate on. If these three marks, like any of them are no, it's a no from my side to move forward.
Yeah, I mean that's actually great. There's a couple of great things to look for, and I guess you've gone through exits at different levels. As an IC, as a lead IC, as a lower tier management, higher tier management, 3 different outcomes as well, and I guess 3 different environments, right? I mean, obviously 2 public companies, another startup, but in the case of Autodesk, you went to a whole new team. You mentioned to be patient and let the emotions calm down and let things play out. When you're in that position and you're like, hey, I'm going to let things play out, obviously there is the danger of just getting comfortable and not paying attention. And I think that's sometimes very difficult for people, is understanding patience versus comfort. Because obviously it's easy just to ebb and go with the flow versus being patient and still taking on the signs and evaluating. So how did you just draw the distinction between, I'm comfortable and being patient?
It's a brilliant question. The tricky part is when I go through these kind of things, I do a lot of writing. And that has been the constant anchor for me to go through all the acquisitions, all the stressful situations. And this was the habit that got formed after working with my exec coach. We've tried so many different tactics to sort of figure out how I can mentally navigate some of these things, and writing was the thing. So when I do a lot of writing, I start seeing emerging patterns, right? So when I'm in a comfortable situation, some level of boredom starts coming up for me, and I end up writing about it. I'm like, I don't feel like I'm making the impact, or I feel like it's turning into a 9-to-5 job, or I feel like I'm not making progress in my own personal growth. And I think that's the signal. And writing helps me introspect as well as retrospect, right? And that's the anchor that has helped me a lot on just, I ask 3 questions to myself. My usual diary is very simple. I ask 4 questions to myself. What am I grateful for? What's going well? What's not going well? How am I going to show up differently tomorrow? So if there is something I have done wrong, incorrectly, there is a growth opportunity. So I can't get to writing it every day, but at least 3 to 4 times a week, if I write it, then when I look back, I start seeing patterns emerge out of it. And I think that's the signal I take on. Otherwise, it's really, really easy to just go with the flow. Let's not make any changes. So that's the tool I have used. Now, does it work for everybody? I'm not sure, but this has definitely helped me. Writing in notebooks and Google Sheets has definitely helped me figure out these things.
No, that's really interesting, because I think you always hear about people writing, and obviously these days, very people actually take the time to write. We're all behind a laptop or computer. We're all typing things out. And I know there's been, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not an expert. I know there's scientific studies on how the brain interprets actual handwritten stuff versus typing. I guess when you look at your process of writing and you look at the process of going back and reflecting, is, obviously I'm sure you have a process, but how often do you go back to look at your writing and kind of review what you've noted, written down to kind of notice those patterns? Just out of curiosity, because I think you're obviously picking up some signals along the way and how you're interpreting them.
Yeah. So the month ends, I read, there's around on an average 15 notes. I don't get to writing it every day, but there are 15 notes. So when the month flips on the last day, I review the last month and actually do an analysis on, am I repeating my mistakes? Because if I'm not showing up the next day differently, am I not doing it? What's not working? Are there consistent themes around it? What I'm grateful for, right? It's addressing all the three aspects of brain, right? Because otherwise it turns, if I'm not talking about what I'm grateful for, I'm always looking at glass half empty, which is not a healthy sign, because the next question I'm asking is what's not really working. So I'm asking myself, so I need to have a practical, pragmatic perspective of what is half full, what is half empty, instead of only looking at part of the glass in that sense. So I do a monthly ritual of checking in. And then there are times when there are epiphanies. There are times which are like, I'm just not being resilient. I just need to be. And then that retrospection helps. So month flips, retrospection happens is my ritual.
Awesome. I that's fantastic. And I guess as you kind of, you've gone from organization to organization, and obviously you've gone through 3 different experiences. You're obviously very cognizant of your own mental model above everything else. You're always adding to your toolbox, I'm sure. You're always adding new skills and new perspectives. You're writing, you're reflecting. So obviously, I'm sure that toolbox is growing. And as you go from job to job, and you have more tools, sometimes the challenge is what tools you use, because job one, you only do it one way. Now do it a number of ways. And how do you kind of go through these different experiences, and as you come into the next one? So obviously you're a new company, you bring a wealth of experience. How do you know which one of those you want to pull from? Obviously you're probably you're analyzing, you're looking at yourself, but how do you kind of evaluate what you need to do?
Situational leadership, I think, is the name of the game these days. A lot of times during the interviews, I get asked a question like, so what is your leadership style? So there is definitely, every leader has a default leadership style. For example, my leadership style by default, when things are all well, is servant leadership, right? I'm here for my organizations and individuals and the leaders so they are successful. So that's sort of the mindset I go with. But like you said, the toolbox is real, right? Because there are situations where somebody is talking to me and I need to be that active listener, so that they just want to vent. They actually don't want advice. They don't want anything. They just want to vent. And I'm going to give them that space to vent. And then we are going to talk about, so what are the next steps? There's no conversation back and forth. In some cases, I have to just let that problem be for a while and not take any action whatsoever and be patient. Otherwise, I have to teach people how to ride bicycle. I can't be their guardrails all the time or side wheels all the time. So that awareness of taking a pause and looking at the toolbox and say that this needs a hammer, this needs a screwdriver, this needs a drill, is very important. And I call this, instead of reacting, responding. And that pause of thinking it through for us, like 5 to 10 seconds of what's really needed, is very, very important from my personal experience. And that situational leadership has done tremendous sort of impact to how I operate. There is an underlying, very important element to this, Amir, which is empathy. I can decide to choose which tool to use, but if the other side is going to get hurt by it, or not going to listen, or not going to get shut down by it, I need to be more aware of what tool to use, right? Because if I have to give somebody feedback and the personalities that they like a little bit softer tone as compared to direct and blunt, I have to use that tool. I'm still giving feedback, but I have to use that tool so that I don't shut them down or they don't get defensive in that situation. It could be decision making, it could be feedback, it could be any situation whatsoever. So that tool, choosing that tool has to come with empathy to understand who's at the table or who's on the other side and what type of personality are they in order to navigate that particular situation. And empathy in leadership is starting to surface more and more these days, but I still don't think it gets talked about that much on how important it is to actually be flexible and adapt to the people on the other side as a leader. A lot of time, there are power dynamics, and the expectation is the organization has to align with the leaders, with their style, and then leaders can be only one style. But that plasticity, that adaptability of leaders is extremely important on how to navigate all these situations.
I like that. I guess two things. One, you're a very reflective person. You write, you journal. So the fact that, what you describe, your situational servant leadership, empathy, I mean, that all fits. And I think what comes to my mind is, you are like this. Not every leader is like this, but also the people that work for you and how you're going to impact their leadership. Because obviously what you do isn't just natural to everyone. Now, different leadership styles fit different personalities, but some of it is more maybe nurture, right? It's not pure nature. If you've seen another manager behave a certain way, have a certain process, you might gravitate towards that and develop that leadership style. When you're looking at people, that you've worked with that became future leaders, how did you help, them develop some of these skills that have developed in you?
A few years ago, I went through a workshop on how to coach. And one of the important things I learned in that workshop was what I thought was coaching was actually mentoring. And coaching is the best way to actually go through that situation, right? So the example that everybody uses is, instead of giving them a fish, teach them how to fish. And that teaching them how to fish requires a lot of things. I'll again go back to active listening, of asking powerful questions instead. So like, where do you think you're stuck? Instead of saying, oh, here is where you're stuck, let me give you a list of 5 things, right? Asking them where you're stuck, asking them which areas you want to give it a try. What do you think are your possible solutions? And then asking which solutions you want to prioritize. So going with these powerful questions and helping people go through their self-discovery to actually figure out who they are. And then at the same time, creating psychological safety to fail. A lot of times what happens is, as the coaching happens like any sport, right? Something like, it's not always going to be like you coach once and then it's amazing. It never works like that. So that ability to like, okay, it didn't work out. That's fine. We tried this path. It didn't go in the direction we wanted to. Let's figure out the next path. But you come up with it. Instead of me telling them, you coming up with it is the sort of the way of things, so that they figure out their personality on how they want to do it. And then sort of the objectives are met by asking these powerful questions. So I can talk a lot about these things, but that's sort of the way I have approached this is that coaching is necessary. And then there are critical opportunities show up for these leaders, maybe 5-6 opportunities that show up throughout the year. At that time, reminding them that like, look, we have talked about these things. I have confidence in you. Go and tackle them. And then pretty much getting out of their way so that they can actually learn how to fish in those situations. So there's a trust element. There is a safety element. There is creating a safe space element for them to fail. So all these things have to come together to build the right culture. And if you remember, my criteria was amazing culture. So it has to be that growth culture within the organizations, within the leaders that, all right, this didn't work. I'm just going to get up, shake it off, and I'm going to try something else. And that grit and resilience is something that is so important when it comes to all these situations. And that's the nurturing part, I believe, because growth mindset is definitely nurture.
I think that's fantastic. And I've heard you mention coaching. And I know you mentioned, even going back to the writing, you hired someone that helped you in an executive coaching level to get there. You've referenced being a coach. Not everyone goes and hires a coach. Everyone knows how to do the job. When you go become a manager, no one actually continues more education. We read, watch videos, podcasts, but getting a coach is a real commitment. I guess from your perspective, what drove you to go, I need to have a coach?
Biggest driver for me was I needed a mirror, a blunt, honest mirror. And what I've realized over time, and this is the part that I don't like about hierarchical organizations, is I always feel like as an executive and head of a department, actually trying to see the mirror of all the good, bad, and the ugly was hard. And if I look at it, I have my experiences, my life experiences, my traumas, my situation. So that reflection is not exactly clear on what the real issues are and what the real problems are and what the real strengths are. And I honestly needed a mirror to tell me, these are my strengths and these are my weaknesses, and these are my blockers from seeing the clear reflection of myself. So it came from that whole desire on how can I keep getting better? These are my strengths. I'm going to rely on them, unprejudiced, clear eyes. And these are my areas of improvement that I need to work on. And every quarter, I took on one area of improvement that I wanted to work on that was feeling a little bit painful or an obstacle. And we would just work on it, have conversations, work on it, wait for opportunities, show up differently to opportunities. In some cases, absolutely abysmally fail and repeat the mistakes. And then, so that continuous growth, and there is still tremendous amount of improvement I still need to make. Amir, it's not like because I've done coaching, I'm excellent. I can list 10 things right now that I need to get better at, but that active work that needs to be put in, instead of saying, okay, I'm SVP of engineering, I'm an executive of a very successful startup. Like, it's easy to just sit there and say that it's all good. I don't need to do anything. I can just show up. I can have the meetings. I can have conversations, and I can go. That personal desire to excel and keep getting better at it is something that drove me into getting a coach, and somebody who was like blunt, direct, and honest was something that I really, really craved for, which is hard to get.
No, I think that's fantastic, and I think also understanding yourself and knowing the type of person that you need to interface with you is big, because if you get the wrong voice telling you something, you necessarily don't respond. So I think it's great that you understood the type of person you needed to be in your corner.
Yeah, my first conversation with her was completely break me down and let's put myself together again. Like, that was her thing. I wanted her to be absolutely hard on me, not give me any sort of like, no, this is fine. I give you benefit of doubt. It's like no benefits of doubts. And that was my safe space where I can just like share everything. And it gets, in some cases, in the leadership roles, it starts getting lonely, right? So you need somebody to just be like, everything in my brain and heart, I need to speak up. And I wish more leaders would take that opportunity on and have that partner so that they can get better. And there is a outlet to express everything that's going on.
Yeah, I guess last thing before we wrap up, I know you mentioned that was your safe space. I mean, at the executive level, there's a lot of back channel conversations when people want to move around. That's a challenge, right? I mean, you mentioned safe space. That's, you can't necessarily just tap on another executive and talk to them, because, you just don't know. And obviously, if you don't feel comfortable and you don't feel 100% secure in how you can, ask that person to break you down, take on that feedback, tell them how you truly feel, that raw emotion, that raw component, that coaching dynamic probably doesn't yield as much as it otherwise should.
Yeah, it doesn't, right? And that's why trying to get somebody outside to help coach on these leadership challenges and how to navigate things is super important, because you get an objective point of view. There isn't conflict of interest, relationships are not at stake, and just you can be 100% there in those situations.
Absolutely. Ashu, I was going to say, like, we could, I could keep asking you, and I think you've got more to give, but I know you got to get back to it. Before I let you go, I like to ask each guest, if they could have a future guest cover a topic for them, a subject that you'd be interested in listening to, what would you like to hear more about?
One of the topics that's been hovering in my head, and I've done a lot of reading about it, but there aren't a lot of discussions happening around this, is the engineering matrix. What to measure for the engineering organization, right? There are process metrics like Scrum and Agile. Then there are DevOps metrics like Dora. There are engineering metrics like cycle times. Then there are other metrics where teams get error quotas. What is the matrix, that a set of metrics that needs to be measured so that organizational behavior is driven by it, and those could be the healthy markers? It's been an ongoing topic in my head. I haven't figured out the right solution. So if anybody who you think can have that discussion, I would love to hear it.
Absolutely. That's a good one. I got to see if we can find somebody who's an expert in that space. And if somebody wants to reach out to you and connect with you regarding anything you've mentioned on the podcast, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
The best way to get a hold of me is my LinkedIn, Ashu Agte. Just find me on LinkedIn, send me a connection request, put a context saying, heard talking to you, talking about these topics with Amir, and let's connect and let's talk and get some conversations going.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Ashu. Thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you know someone that can speak to Ashu's topic, I think, understanding how those metrics and analytics are being applied across engineering, love to have you on. Secondly, if you found the episode useful, share it with somebody else you think might like it as well. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, review. We always want that. And that's how the podcast has been growing. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.